Hello, everybody. Sorry, I haven't been on for a very long time. I've been in Poland shooting a film, but I'm here today with Connor. He has an account on Instagram, Twitter, or X, whichever you prefer, and YouTube called Soothsayings, and he also has a website called healand.org. I'll have all of this also in the description below in the video. And basically, why I want to talk to Connor today is to basically discuss the connection of an evolution, you can say, of Germanic and Viking paganism into Christianity, and how Christianity takes some of those rituals and you can say doesn't destroy them, but keeps what is good and then gets rid of the evil, you can say. And I saw Connor's work on his accounts and stuff, and I thought, the images and things he shows are basically perfect to kind of connect these two things. So thank you, Connor, for popping in, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm
so
always
first,
happy.
Yeah. So first, if you can kind of, I guess, go into what made you interested in kind of like going this route and looking into kind of like these Germanic and Viking tribes and their kind of like Christian backgrounds.
Well, sort of what has led me to it was originally I read the book called The Helliand, otherwise known as the Old Saxon Gospel, which is a adaptation of the gospel narrative, written in the form of Germanic epic heroic poetry, and it presents the Christian narrative and the traditional true gospel narrative of the life of Christ in a framework and a perspective that can be easily understood and that is familiar to the Germanic peoples and resonates more within their the framework that they would live in. And it was, it's this theologically accurate story, and it was written by a priest at the commission of Charlemagne after the conquering of the Saxon peoples and the Christianization there. And it just like the way that it's written and the story the way that it tells it and the framing of Christ's life in that way just very resonated with me at a sort of deeper level, and that led me to look more into this framework that had been built in the Iron Age for the Germanic peoples and their understanding of Christianity. And I found all of these other examples of things just like this. And I found that there's really nothing that is preventing us from experiencing this same framework today. And I think, if you ask me, it's kind of necessary, because what had led it to be drifting away and why we don't see it anymore is the Protestant Reformation, and that sort of split there had these enculturated elements kind of scattered all over the place. And it's been my kind of mission to reconsolidate them and to have all of this back in one place, to have this sort of popular piety, is the phrase I've used for it, back in the church.
Yeah, it seems like today there's a very duality type of thinking today in terms of you have these you can say these group of Christians that are pure, like these puritanical, like it has to be completely clean, and any images or symbolism that isn't like inherently shown in the gospel, you can say, or isn't inherently somehow associated with Christ, as evil. And then you have the opposite side that just it's basically just a return to paganism. It's just like saying like this symbol was originally done by Viking. I'm gonna kind of stay within the Vikings, though. This was also, I know a lot of this stems into like all forms of paganism and the Germanic
Mhm.
tribes, but there's like the other side that states that like based on time frame where it's like the Vikings thought of this first, or this pagan tribe thought of this first, therefore
Mhm.
it's pagan, right? So Christians stole it all. But the story seems to be kind of in the middle, right? Like it's both. To some extent, it's both. Um, how how do you think it's best to kind of like communicate that or show that? I know on the Instagram account you show, for example, like the fourth cross and things like that. But
Mhm.
what are
Mhm.
is there other ways to kind of like communicate this other than just visually? Let's say.
Well, I think my perspective on what you were saying about it being in the middle um, is there's a little bit more nuance than that. And before we had started recording, I had shown you "Crossing the Threshold of Hope" by Pope John Paul II, and it touches on this about and the Nostra Aetate. I think that's how you pronounce it. It's Latin, so I'm not the best with Latin, but from the Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council, they talk about the relationship with the Church of other religions. Um, we know from the Genesis narrative that all mankind stems from the original people that created by God, and so therefore all religions stem from corruptions of the one true religion. Um, there's a for example, what you were talking about, like where people say that Christianity is this just it's just one, like most often atheists will say this, that Christianity is just another retelling of the same pagan narratives that have been retold forever. And examples they'll point to is, for example, if we want to stay within the Viking narratives, an example they'll point to is the binding of Odin to the World Tree. Are you familiar with that story at all?
Yeah, I don't know like all the details, but I know the general sense of the binding. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And where he is tied up on the World Tree as a sacrifice and is stabbed in the side by a spear and hangs and dies there, for 6 days. Um, Obviously, there's quite a bit of similarity there between the crucifixion, where God was tied to wood or nailed to wood, stabbed in the side, died, and rose 3 days later, which is a divisible of 6. Um, but see, the thing is well, that had already been prophesized in the Old Testament that God would be bound to a tree and killed. This is there's a phrase. It's there's a poem, and it talks about one of the psalms. I can't remember the number of the psalm off the top of my head, but it says that God will reign ligno, which means from the tree. God will rule the nations of the world from a tree. Um, and so that prophecy had already existed within the Hebrew religion prior to Nordic paganism ever having a runic inscription on anything, before the Poetic Edda had ever been written. And a lot of this is true for all of these things, that we find often that the pagans will have these things, and they are stemming from what had already existed in the Hebrew religions. But I think it's hard to explain this to people, because if you're looking at it from the pagan mindset or from a secular mindset, the seculars will often say, well, that's just because all of these religions stem from some animist proto-religion. That's nothing like that, blah, 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 blah. Or they'll say that maybe that it was made up when the Christian monks were reinscribing the old pagan tales. And so, yeah, for your question, how do we show people that this is a prefigurement towards the Christianization, is, I think, it's something that definitely is reckoned with, and I think it really depends on how open-minded somebody is towards the Germanic Christian mindset, or just the Christian mindset overall. Yeah, I'd say visually is probably one of the most effective, just showing, this stuff. But I think if you want a good path is looking at the history, especially going back to the Indo-Europeans or the Japhethites. Are you familiar with Japheth in the Bible?
No, yeah. I am I'm not familiar with the Japhethites, no.
Well, so in the in Genesis, there's obviously the story of Noah and his ark, right?
Yep.
Well, after Noah and his ark all happen, Noah has 3 sons. He has Shem, Japheth, and Ham. And these 3 sons will go on to form all the races of the world, which would then, it's kind of complicated because there's the Tower of Babel as well, but fundamentally, you can derive lineage, any human being can derive lineage from those 3 sons. And Japheth is the father of Europeans, and the biblical narrative regarding Japheth and the Japhethites almost exactly mirror the migration patterns of the Indo-Europeans, which is a scientific term for a group of pastoral peoples, pastoral meaning kind of like migratory, who would go on to become the European peoples, the Italians, the Germanics, the Romance, the Hellenics, the Slavics, right? And studies, linguistic and back etymology kind of working from all the different religions of the Indo-European people, the pagan religions of the Indo-European people, when they split out, into the Hellenics, the Slavs, the Germanics, the Romance, is they worshipped a central figure called Deus Pater. I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation, but translated into modern Latin is Deus Pater, which you might recognize as in nomine Patri et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Deus, God, Pater, the Father. They worshipped a deity named God the Father, which is a pretty on-the-nose, explicit link directly to the Old Testament. The Japhethites, who left the Fertile Crescent where Noah, had finished with his ark, had left and traveled north and followed these migratory patterns, would have worshipped God the Father, and obviously so the people that now the scientists are, these academics are now recognizing, are that the same people who left the Fertile Crescent and went north and followed these migratory patterns worshipped a deity called God the Father. And so, even, I know we're getting a little bit far away from the Nordic religions, but it is even more explicit if we look at the Mediterranean pagan religions, specifically the Roman and Greek mythologies, because Jupiter is a combination of Deus Pater. Jupiter, God the Father, is what Jupiter means. And Zeus is a shortening of the same thing. It's Zeus is Deus. So I mean, I think you can kind of see that this is a very strong link. Where it went with the Germanic, or I guess you could say the Viking mythology, is he became Tyr, Deus, Pater, Tyr, you can kind of see, but he was the god of war, which he was the god of war, which the aspects of Deus Pater got ascribed onto Odin, the All-Father. Obviously, still Father being the important part of that, God the Father, as they didn't know about the Son, and the Holy Ghost was not as emphasized in the Old Testament. He's still the Holy Ghost is still present, obviously, but in the Hebrew pre Messianic sort of religions is not as emphasized. So we do see most centrally God the Father is the prominent figure, and that's what we see reflected in these corrupted pagan religions, right?
Yeah, so I mean, you mentioned this earlier. I think it's interesting in terms of a secular argument or atheistic argument of saying, like, here are all the similar patterns in these stories, therefore it's false. Where I look at that and I say, well, if you have all these people around the world telling a similar story, that shows me that it's more true. I mean, there's a difference because obviously there's we as people also have, based on where geographically you're located, you're also interacting with that particular world. So you're gonna, the story that you can say, this taste of the story is going to change to some in some way, so that people can you can say participated directly based on where they're also located geographically, right? So, you know, if you go somewhere to, like, let's say Norway, you obviously have a lot of like mountains and like a different landscape where you might have more of a calling of like going up a mountain or something, experiencing lightning or whatever, and then you have the telling, the shifting of what you said, saying of like, then you might have a shifting where, like, you know, thunder is this powerful force, and you have, okay, so this is Odin now, or Thor or whatever, right? Like this god of thunder, he's the father, he's the all father, right? So you have this slight shift geographically. But I do think I think it's just, to me, it's almost like funny that you would say like, oh, all cultures of the world have some kind of flood story, so that means it's false.
Yeah.
As if the criteria is uniqueness, right? Like it has to be unique for it to be true. Whereas scientifically speaking, you wouldn't use that criteria in that method at all. So if you had people around the world telling you their weather is changing, let's say, then you have scientists saying that supposedly you can say something like climate is changing, whatever, but for some reason when it comes to stories, it's that mindset is shifted.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. Oh, here it is. That what you were saying about lightning specifically reminded me of a verse, and this is a verse that for me is very important when it comes to understanding this perspective of a European and a Germanic Christianity. And it comes from the Gospel of Matthew. If I can find Gospel of Matthew. Mark. So it's here. There we go. So the Gospel of Matthew has this verse, which I think is important because it is one of the most explicit references I find. Well, besides the whole Gospel of Luke, but outside the Gospel of Luke and the post-gospel texts by Paul and etc. Right? Here we go. So, because it says, here's what it says. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes as far as the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. And that terminology, the lightning out of the east, the flash of holy light that was Christ, and it shown even as far as the West, I think is an amazing prophecy that came true. I mean, the center of Christianity for the entire history of Christianity has been the West, Europe, and which is remarkable considering the lightning, Christ, came out of the East. And it is also ties into an earlier prophecy. It ties into an earlier prophecy made about Japheth from Genesis, which is Genesis 9, if I can find it, 9:24. This is what Noah says. Noah makes a prophecy to his son. He says, God shall enlarge Japheth so long as he lives in the tent of Shem. Now, obviously, what in those days, to dwell in somebody's tent meant to sort of be in their camp, I guess you could say, in like a vernacular term, follow their beliefs. And immediately before, blessed by the Lord my God be Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. So Shem, which is the predecessor of the Semites, which is the Middle Easterner people, blessed be the Lord God of Shem, and God shall enlarge Japheth as long as he dwells in the tent of Shem. Now, we're living in a sort of post-Christian world in regards to Europe, but if we go back for the last 1,000 years, when the European peoples were massively Christian, were the center, were the shining light of the lightning from the east, was on the west. Well, that was the period in which God enlarged the European people. They made massive empires and evangelized, like Jesus, one of his last commandment was evangelize to all people of the world, to go out and preach to all nations. God enlarged the European people to each antipode of the world. I mean, there was not a single hectare that was not being preached by European feet in that time. And I think this is important. Like, these are two very verses that kind of reflect these prophecies that came true when it came to God and the Europeans. And that's another argument I'll see people make, specifically pagans. If we were wanting to refute pagans, is pagans will say, oh, this is a foreign religion. It's foreign to the Europeans. It has nothing to do with us. Well, there are two verses right there that make explicit prophecies about the outcome of the European people and their nature within God's plan. I mean, there was a reason why God chose to be born under a European monarch. He was born under the Roman Empire. And I think that's part of what his plan, because God, and this overarching message that God takes things that are corrupted and unjust and flips them into good and just things. The corrupted Roman Empire and the corrupted religions that from the Japhethites, well, he flipped it, and they dwelt in the tent of Shem, and they came into Christendom, and they became just and righteous, and they preached to all nations, and they fulfilled as to the best of their ability and continue to that sort of prophecy that God had asked of us. And now that we're living in a sort of post-Christian world, we're starting to see that it's shrinking. Japheth is shrinking because we're no longer dwelling in the tent of Shem. We're so concerned with these materialistic things, this greed, this
Yeah,
Uh,
and the thing is, like, what you're explaining here is like what these stories are trying to tell us, and what these patterns even is that it's not arbitrary, right? Like you're
mhm,
the world is structured in a particular way, right? Like something, for example, something like a hierarchy is true. There's no
mhm,
there's you can act out a hierarchy to show it, but there's no necessarily physical form to it. But it's like this invisible truth that exists. Like even you as an
mhm,
individual cannot function without having some kind of hierarchy, right? Like you can say that your head is the king of the rest of the body, right? And without the head, the rest of your body cannot function. In the same way, what you gear as more important to your in your life, and then what's least important is also a hierarchy. And so
mhm,
these patterns are not arbitrary. And the thing is that all these past traditions and everything that existed is because humans recognize these patterns, right? And then it's geared towards a certain tradition and rituals and stuff to celebrate them. The thing, and so with that, what I want to go further into also is because you mentioned like Christians going out and preaching. I know often it's said the forms of preaching are usually told as if people were forced to convert, right? Or like it's
mhm,
a use of power. But I don't like if you look at something like the Vikings, for example, they actually did, you can say, worship power, right? That was their main goal. I mean, that's what their hierarchy was. And they were one of the most, to some extent, one of the most brutal warriors or like soldiers that ever seen. So thinking of Christian men that are their main goal isn't necessarily to fight. I mean, there is an aspect of justice, something, but it's not a war-based
mhm.
like faith. And to think that Christians went in there and somehow forced a group of people like that to convert is almost laughable, right? What's what's
Like,
what's more power like that's what's so miraculous about that. I mean, Christ shows that on the cross too, the fact that he conquered Rome through he conquered Rome without picking up a single sword. In the same manner, Christians, you can say, conquered the world without picking up swords like Vikings did,
mhm,
right? And so like, but there's something about the story that has a fullness that even caused some brutal people like the Vikings to shift into like our traditions, you can say, right? So I
mhm.
don't know if you want to expand on that or
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, the argument that a lot of them make is it is pretty silly. I mean, the you're 100% right that the pagans, they basically did worship power. You know, they worshipped ancestors and all that, and but the power was a big important part of it. I mean, there's not a coincidence that the um the name for uh God the Father from the Japhethite uh Hebraic faith got transformed into Tyr, the god of war, right? Because that was so important to them. But really, if you look at the endless examples of these conversion stories, there's only really two instances where force was a factor in the entire his conversion story of the Germanic peoples. Is Verdun, the massacre at Verdun committed by Charlemagne, and later on was the forced conversion of the Baltic peoples by the Teutonic Knights. But prior to that, uh, if you look at the Anglo-Saxons, the Danish, the Norwegians, the Swedish, Icelandics, it was entirely willingly. I mean, there's a story of Frisian king, I think it was King Radbod, or Redbad. Maybe I can double check. King Redbad. Yeah, King Redbad, the king of the Frisians, was sacrificing a man uh, in a human sacrifice, and um, a bishop came up to him, and he kept the bishop. This is the funny thing. He kept the bishop around as like a I don't know how you say, a kind of like a sideshow, I guess. Was he had this bishop? He wasn't a Christian; he was a pagan. He had this bishop in his court that he kept as a sideshow. And he was planning on executing this person as a sacrifice to the gods, and the bishop begged him not to. Either maybe it wasn't a bishop; it was a priest, but you get the idea, right? This cleric is begging him not to, and he says, "Well, the only way I won't is if your God stops me." And I don't remember the full story, but long story short, I can't. I'm trying to look at the story again, and I can't find the story off the top of my head. But essentially, is this, without lifting a finger, this priest is able to stop this this sacrifice, this human sacrifice, and it was a miraculous thing, and it did lead to the conversion of the Frisian peoples. As these Frisian peoples, they saw this firsthand exercise of power of God over their gods, and they could see that, well, there's some substance to this thing. You know, they'd been worshiping these pagan gods and they'd see nothing, and now they have a tangible miracle to witness. And the same thing is true with the missionary work of Saint Boniface. Are you familiar with the famous story of Boniface with the cutting down of the tree? Yeah. And that's actually where we get the Christmas tree from, because Boniface, directly next to where he planted, to where he cut down the oak tree, he planted an evergreen, because it has 3 points for the Holy Trinity, and it never wilts, because God's love is everlasting.
So here's a good to kind of give another question in terms, since you mentioned this Boniface, the cutting down the tree, is kind of to this kind of is what I mentioned in the beginning goes into the other side of more of like the puritanical view, you can say, of Christianity, right? And that you had this group of people that were I don't know, I remember, like, worshiping the tree, or like had this tree had some sort of meaning to this group of people that bound them together, right? And Saint Boniface replaces the tree, and so but he replaces it to something more appropriate. Now, like, symbolically speaking, it's like the vision is also, you can see that he almost like rips out, you can say, the old tree of the old gods, you can say, rips that out and puts in the new tree of Christ. But in essence, to some extent, they can continue if they had some kind of rituals with the tree, you can kind of continue it, but now, instead of it being geared to whatever God it was before, now it's geared towards Christ, right? And so they were able to keep that tradition or ritual. Now, in the thought process of, I think it's mostly Protestant groups, and then unfortunately, I feel like sometimes some Catholics, specifically in the like states, kind of fall into like a Protestant view of certain stories and stuff as well. Like, kind of, is that because that tradition was first pagan, that means it's always pagan, even if it was kind of like redirected, right? And so how do you I'm trying to think, like, how do you kind of like what's your view on that? How do you break it down, right? Because like I mentioned before we started recording, you can also argue like pagans probably shook hands to greet each other. So if you're a Christian and you shake hands with other Christians, are you performing some pagan ritual now because it was originally that? Like, are we limited to who came up with it first, kind of thing?
Well, I think the Vatican words it better than I ever could. because this is what they say, and I was referring to it earlier, but essentially this is what they said. It says the Catholic Church rejects nothing that is true and holy in these religions. She regards with sincere reverence those ways of conduct and of life, these precepts and teachings, which, though differing in many aspects from the ones she holds and sets forth, nonetheless reflect a ray of truth which enlightens all men. Indeed, she proclaims and ever must proclaim Christ, the way, the truth, the life, in whom men may find the fullness of religious life, in whom God has reconciled all things to himself. Which is a very fancy way of saying that, if these rituals, if you want to use that term, if these rituals like were true and just, if they reflected the ray of truth that God is the way, the truth, the life, then Christ redeems them and brings them within his vision. There's and I think, that's kind of the long and short of it. But there is still important things. I think, like what you were saying earlier about, the opposite end of the scale is this redemption can only go so far. Like the followers of Moses who started worshiping the golden calf, they believed they were worshiping the Hebrew God. That's what they thought. They were worshiping the Hebrew God with the golden calf, but they were being misled. And so I think prudence is important. I think, and the Catholic Church, amazing, amazing credit to them in this time of such it's called the Dark Ages. In the Dark Ages, they were very much able to exercise this prudence. There's a lost work by Saint Boniface, which goes over, and it's so unfortunate that it's lost, but we have references to it, and we have book of contents, but we don't know the actual content. Table of contents, sorry. But it goes over basically every pagan practice and kind of sorts it out into, this is okay, but, this is not. So, for example, an example of something that would be okay versus an example of something that's not, the not thing is blot. The active of sacrifice of animals or sacrificing human beings, which they were known sometimes to do. That's not acceptable. That's because Christ is the ultimate blot, you could say, but then, like I said, that's it's even that something that is unacceptable to do is still redeemed in Christ, because Christ was a sacrifice. He was the sacrificial lamb, he was like the son of I think it was Abraham or Abram. You know what the story I'm referring to. Brain fart right now. It's this something that is unacceptable. This blot, the sacrifice to the pagan gods, which you can't make sacrifices to to the true God, because God is the sacrifice. He is the ultimate blot. But versus something that would be acceptable is like a cymbal, a feast. They would hold feasts in honor of their ancestors. And this book, again, it's a very good resource by Pope John Paul, talks about how worship of ancestors is a corruption or a misunderstanding of the reverence we're intended to give to the communion of saints. Well, yes, we can pray to those who come before us. Yes, we can ask them, for guidance. We can celebrate them with feasts, cymbals, but they're not God, like pagans often would think. They're not these avatars and all that. They in many times are saints, and we should still revere them. We should still pray and ask their guidance, hold feasts in their honor, but it's important to understand the way. And that's one of the things that, like how I started this conversation, the Hellion, it tried to contextualize this in a way, telling the gospel narrative in a way that was most conducive to their mindset. And there's many other things. There's the De Falsis Dies, which is the name of a Old English homily given by, I can't remember his name right now, but an Old English Elfric, given by Elfric, talks about stuff exactly like this. And the priests did, a bang-on job, at doing this in those days. And I just find it quite fascinating, I have a leaflet that I've made, which talks about how in the most rune stone populated region of Sweden, which has some of the most rune stones ever, I think some odd 80% of them are Christian in nature, which shows that the deep underlying influence that Christianity had on the Germanic peoples, and the fact that such a strong concentration of rune stones, which we often think of as the penultimate example of the Germanic peoples, is Christian in nature, inherently Christian in nature, which is something that people don't recognize or even think about.
Yeah, what's also funny is that in some sense, Christians saw more value in the pagan stories than the pagans themselves. Because the only reason we know what we know about paganism is because of Christians, because Christians are the only ones that recorded any of those stories. I mean, there's no, from my understanding, there's almost no written account, because pagan stories were mostly oral tradition, and there's no necessarily actual written account written by a pagan themselves telling these stories. It's all from Christian accounts to some extent, with maybe exception with some very basic, something like cave paintings or runes or something like that. But
there are basically I was going to say that there's allusions, like ALLU allusions, kind of like how a good way to understand the way that the pagans talked about their religion prior to the Christians recording them, is imagine you're reading a novel, and the novel all of a sudden quotes the Bible, and it doesn't say like Matthew or anything. It just quotes the Bible, or as I walk through the shadow of the valley of death, or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just in the book, and it doesn't really draw attention to it. That is basically the entire way that the pagan people talked about their religion. It was these allusions that everyone was expected to know. So they have these rune stones from the time when it's a drawing of a story that everyone was just, or a writing that's just an allusion from the poetic edda or whatnot, that everyone was just expected to know, and I think that's probably the best way to understand how they kind of perceived their religion. They didn't it's something like, oh, everybody knows what this means, right?
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to something that was studied and meditated, right? Like when we think about the Bible, and that's something that we're expected, to understand and to meditate, and that's why it was so important, when they were in the Middle Ages, when illiteracy was so high. And this is something that I personally have a vendetta with, is people always say, well, the Catholic Church was trying to hide the Bible from people. This is patently untrue. Have you ever heard of a pauper's Bible?
Mm-hmm.
They made comic books. They made the Bible as a comic book, so people who couldn't read could understand, and they had these stained glass. The stained glass, that's one of the big things with stained glasses, is it was recreations of the Bible so that people who couldn't read could understand it.
And then icons too, right? You have
Yeah.
more so. I mean, it exists in the West, but more so in the Eastern traditions. You have imagery of icons through mosaics and stuff that people can look at and meditate upon.
Well, I
Before
mean,
there was text too,
to
right?
tie back into this, I think the oldest Western icon of Mary and the Christ child is right next to a runic inscription. It's on St. Cuthbert's coffin. There is an icon of Mary and the Christ child, and it is in a runic inscription, IHS XPS, but in runes. So, the way they would have said it. And they have the four evangelists as well. They have the four evangelists, all with their names written in runes. And that's on St. Cuthbert's coffin. And that's, for me, shows the interconnectedness and the deep entrenching of Christianity within Germanic culture, and I think vice versa as well to a certain extent, is the Christian culture with Germanicism. But a lot of this has been since lost, forgotten. People don't acknowledge a lot of this beyond the superficial, like with Christmas trees and whatnot. Like a lot of these saints' feasts and all of these subtle traditions that were kept for hundreds and hundreds of years have kind of dissolved. And I don't blame them, because when the Protestant Reformation came about, the Protestants did steal away a lot of this and then rid themselves of it through Puritanism.
Yeah, I can kind of speak to that, because when I went to Scotland and Glasgow, I think is the necropolis church that was dedicated to it started with an M, Saint Mundo or something, but the church itself used to be a Catholic church, but it was completely gutted. I felt like I was in a corpse of like an old, like a huge, magnificent beast that used to exist, and it was completely gutted. The only thing that they left, like, the confessionals were gone. Any movable icons and stuff were gone. The only thing that still existed of the original church is obviously the structure itself and the stained glass windows. Other than that, it was all completely gutted. And like I said, I mean, kind of having the mentality I have now, to me, I felt like I saw like this instinct animal that used to exist, like this being that used to exist, and now it's just the only thing left there is its corpse.
Well, that's exactly it, right? Like, they had inherited, because, the Germanic peoples, basically almost all of them, split away into during the Protestant Reformation, because of the influence of Luther, and obviously because of the Church of England. But I mean, they inherited these traditions, right? These beautiful churches and all this, and a lot of the traditions that I speak about, they inherited them. And then in subsequent centuries and decades, when the Protestant Reformation kind of just started to eat itself apart with Puritans, they gutted it. They gutted a lot of this stuff. And so a lot of this stuff is gone from both traditions, because the Mediterraneans, who, inherited the Catholic Church, basically, almost entirely, sans Austria, Bavaria, etc. Well, the Mediterraneans can't be expected to keep Germanic traditions, because, well, they're not, they're not Germanic, so why would they? And since the Puritans were getting rid of all the Germanic traditions in the Protestant churches, a lot of this stuff was just evaporating from existence. But thankfully, there were still Lutheran churches which stayed around. There is still Austria and Bavaria, which kept a lot of this stuff alive. And now, actually, we're seeing a lot of it returning officially into the Catholic Church with the personal ordinariate of the Chair of St. Peter and the Our Lady of Walsingham.
Yeah, I saw that in England. That was a very cool thing to see.
And yeah, the divine worship services, a lot of them inherit a lot of these beautiful Germanic traditions. And I don't know if you've ever been to a divine worship service, but it is a very, I mean, maybe I guess not quite for you, but for somebody like me and a lot of my fellows in the Fellowship of Germanic Christians, is a very strong attachment to that. And I've spoken with people about this before. Like, I think you might have seen, I talked about how I'd given an interview for a magazine the other day who was doing an article about the fellowship. We did go into more detail about, in my opinion, I think the reintroduction of these elements through a popular piety, and through the reabsorption of some of these Lutheran churches and these Anglican churches, and I think that would be to the benefit of the church, because I mean, right now we have a big issue where if you aren't like Irish, if you're not French, if you're not Italian, if you're not Spanish, well, it kind of does almost feel like there's not quite a place for you in the church. A lot of the recusant heritage is missing, but like I said, this is being repaired very heavily with the Ordinaria and it's one of the fastest growing sections of the church right now is the Ordinaria, which I think is fantastic, and I think is a sign that this enculturation, we're hoping to see return to it.
Yeah. The last thing I kind of wanted to just touch on or discuss with you is I often see, there's, due to our very kind of individualistic, I get what I want, or like just like it's my experience that matters most, you kind of see that kind of mentality leak into media, especially when it comes to looking of all the historical context and stuff that we've been talking about. So, I mean, so like one specific example I have is this, I think, misunderstanding that kind of also joining together of like, these people were forced to convert to Christianity, and so they lost a lot of their traditions, which they didn't. They were kept. It was just all geared towards the highest good opposed to lower principalities. And also that because of this, it caused them to, you can say, miss their previous lives before they were forced to convert. But the thing is, I don't like, once again, touching on what I said earlier, when you have somebody as brutal, for example, as a Viking, that decides to convert, he's not necessarily looking back and missing his old days. The reason he converted is because the story in his eyes of even everything he knew before is completed with Christ, right? So even when you said like Odin was strapped to a tree,
yeah,
Christ goes one step further and goes down into death and defeats death. And that's the end of this. Like, that's the end of this. That's how do you go further into the story? Like, that's the end. He beat death, right? Like, that's the end.
Yeah.
And so when a Viking transitioned, there was no thinking of like, man, I sure miss hearing Thor's hammer, right? Like, you were probably more, like, you can say, a more faithful Catholic or just for the sake of it Christian than Christians that already existed, because you kind of, your story was molded higher into the truth. If I don't know if what I'm saying kind of makes sense, but I feel like there's this misunderstanding that these poor guys had their own traditions, they had to give everything away, and now he's missing the sound of Thor's hammer and like being able to pillage and rape women from his past, kind of thing.
I mean, yeah, what you basically said about this idea of them being even more faithful, I think definitely has a ring of truth to it. I mean, if we want an example in the modern day, take a look at Protestant converts to Catholicism. they are often more faithful because they have these underlying truths in their belief that aren't quite fulfilled, that get made fulfilled in the church. And
or even more so, people that used to belong to the occult, or like ex-witches that convert
yeah,
too.
exactly. But with like paganism, I mean, we have examples of exactly what you're talking about with the world tree, and how they sort of interpreted this was there's a excuse me, there is a runestone called the Gelling Stone, and the Gelling Stone shows Christ strapped to a tree like Odin, obviously making the allusion to that historical story, um, but fulfilled more fully and in its completed nature, because it's a tree, but it's like a cross at the same time, like the um, and
Yeah,
there's
with that really quick, that's important what you mentioned, because in a lot of traditions, like, it's viewed that Christ, I mean, Christ, to some extent, you have, I know there's hymns and stuff that say that Christ was nailed to a tree, like he becomes the tree of life, right? Like,
well,
it's
but
said
there
that
you
he
go.
was that
That
tree beyond the tree of good and evil, like
that
that's
is
what it
the
is.
forked
Yeah.
cross. We spent You mentioned the forked cross earlier. That is what the forked cross means. With it comes from 13th century mystics from the Rhineland. Is the forked cross is the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and Christ's crucifixion upon it is the literal interpretation of his redemption of those sins. Is he was crucified on the tree of good and evil. That's what the forked cross represents. And so you'll often see when they make actual versions of the forked cross, like sculptures in real life, they will make it instead of planked wood, like we'll often see with the Latin crosses, is the arms will be logs. They'll make them out like look like logs, and um, that's like exactly true. Is that that's what the forked cross is. I mean, that's what we were talking about earlier. Is that's what it
Yeah.
is. Is it's the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and
You
that's
see
what.
something like that also in the, sorry to cut you off, but you see
Oh, no
something
worries. Yeah.
similar in Eastern um tradition, like Eastern Catholics, sometimes on the iconostasis in the front, it'll be ornamented with kind of like vines and leaves, because it's like
Mm-hmm.
you're entering into the garden, right? Like that's
Mm-hmm.
you're going to the tree of life, which is Christ on the cross again. And
Mm-hmm.
that pattern once again
Yeah.
is like
I
repeated,
mean,
like you were mentioning, through a lot of traditions.
and that's prefigurement. That is the prefigurement. That's what God. That's what they talk about, in the Nostra Aetate. Still don't know how to pronounce it, but is they say that God works through all of these traditions to uh, glean a light of truth, a ray of truth, to show what is ultimately true, and when you bring them all together, we are the universal church. If you bring all of these universal traditions together, well, that's how you get Christianity. That's how you get the penultimate source, because God is the source of all things. Um, and so, it's like, and that's how they do these studies on language and religion history, is they take all of these different languages, they take all of these different religions, and they like what's similar between them. And if you go all the way back, well, like I said earlier, if we go all the way back on at least the Indo-Europeans, as we find, who do they worship? They worship God the Father. So, um, I mean, that's the it's the source. Is God is the source of all these things. If you take all of them together and you find what's similar between them, it is this one ray of truth that is the through line for everything, is Christ, and ultimately God.
Yeah, no. I also encourage people to look into, I mean, you kind of mentioned it with stuff like Saint Bonaventure, but with different saints from those times too. I mean, there's also Saint Olaf,
Yeah,
who's viewed as like the like one of
it,
the first like Christian, basically Vikings and stuff, and I believe the bishop
the
even had
eternal
them
king of
axed.
Norway, as he's called.
Yeah, and I don't, doesn't the Bishop of Norway also have the axe on his
Mm.
regalia too?
Yeah,
That there's like on the,
they have the axe because he is
yeah,
the
and then even, you know, you go into Ireland and you have something like you know, for me it's one of, I love her to death because she's so weird, but like something like Saint Murrigan, the mermaid saint of the tradition from Ireland too. So like, you know, looking deep into these, you kind of see this link from, like, you can say the traditions of old in the new, and then kind of like joining together into like the fullness of it in a sense. Um, but yeah, I don't know if you have any last things you would like to mention, but you know, this was a great conversation. Do you have anything else you would like kind of to touch on, maybe that I missed or anything like that?
I think overall, I mean, I think that's pretty comprehensive. I mean, we could talk all day about because there is so much depth to all of this. I mean, we didn't even talk about the history of Germanic Christianity in the Americas with Leif Erikson.
Yeah, I
He
know.
was a
There's
Catholic missionary, and then how the oldest Catholic church in North America is Hvalsey Church, which it was built by Vikings. And
Yeah, no, I know.
then
And there's, I mean, there's two different ways to talk about it too. I mean, you've touched a lot about the historicity of a lot of this, and then, I mean, there's so much even to talk about the like mythologies and stories and rituals and tradition themselves, and how that binds people together to some extent, and even
mhm,
thinking about how, you know, once again these barbarians were converted and their focus got reshifting to fighting for Christ instead of thing,
mhm.
and that helped Christianity immensely in some extent to kind of like um you know, protect itself and also create stronger armies, things too, and then
I
the
mean, yeah, exactly like
exploration.
what I was saying about those prophecies and those Bible verses, Matthew 27-24 and Genesis. I forgot the off the top of my head, but like that's the exact thing, right? Is I think it might have been Matthew 24-27, but is these prophecies for what God's intention was for the European people and how he wanted to take these corrupted elements and like we've said before, redeem them in his sort of light.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you, Connor, for the, what's it called, conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Hopefully anyone that watches it will find it fruitful
Hmm.
for further. But I think touching on what we've been touching on is really important, because some of these, I see some of these like old traditions or old patterns in secular people like come up again, and what's it called? You know, like these almost like pagan practices almost coming out without them knowing that they're doing it. And it's like all, it's like these patterns are there again, and I think it's important to kind of look at that. But then I also think it's important to look at that, um you know, Christian tradition is so, I hate this term because it's been so politicized, but it is so, in a sense, like diverse, and there's so much that unites people together, that kind of like supplement something like a mass or a worship service that exists, you can say, more on the ethnic or cultural side of like traditions that the church allowed to bring people together too. But
Hmm.
yeah, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Absolutely.
If you enjoyed the content here on my channel, please like and subscribe. And if you would like to learn more, I have a blog on my website where you can learn more about symbolism, as well as short form videos and articles on my Instagram page. Thank you for listening, and I hope you tune into the next one.